Hello, people. Welcome back to 3.5. Thank you for tuning in again. I am your host, Jack the Beautiful. It means the world to me that you're listening. I'm sorry if you can hear my hat jiggle. I want to stop and talk about this hat. This hat is made by my friend Rich Rocket, owner of Vintage Thrivals. Please check that out. Very talented guy. I love this hat. I love all of his stuff. Really, just extremely talented fellow. What are we going to talk about today? Today, I want to start talking about the mechanisms of the machine that is running the world, which is really colonialism still in a new form, as well as capitalism, which I deem is a extension of colonialism. You might also call it the system of white supremacy. That would lead me into talking about Neely Fuller, but that's another episode I want to dedicate to Neely Fuller. But he is big on producing justice. In fact, producejustice.com is his website. You can get literally a workbook, textbook for counter-racist code and methods and steps that he thinks will help produce justice and or end the system of white supremacy, which he equates as the same thing. But I'm getting off tangent. I want to talk about the machine and the primary functions of the machine for it to exist. I want to specifically talk about capitalism. Like I said, I believe capitalism is an extension of colonialism. But I want to talk about how capitalism functions and even exists, and one of its primary ways that it's able to exist. That is through privatization. That is through property rights, including intellectual property rights, patents, if you will. It is from the enclosure of the commons, which is called privatization. Now, so what is the commons? What are commons? Community-owned resources and or resources that affect the whole community. So that could mean a lot of different things. That means land, common land, that you're able to, that everyone has access to grow food on, to do whatever on, where it's community shared and there's community rules that the community controls. But it is shared in open access and free to access. That's the important part, is that it's free to access these resources. The whole community can access these resources for free. That's really what makes it the commons. The types of commons. Traditional examples of commons include forests, fisheries, or groundwater resources, but increasingly the term commons is used for a broader set of domains. For example, knowledge commons, digital commons, urban commons, health commons, cultural commons, etc. Common land, one type, is land owned and governed collectively by a number of persons. It may also concern land owned by one person, institution, or a number of persons, over which other people have certain traditional rights, such as to allow their livestock to graze upon it, to collect firewood, or to cut turf for fuel. Common land can be found in many different forms. In some areas, such as Belgium and the Netherlands, common land as such has almost completely disappeared in the course of the 19th century. In other countries, such as the United Kingdom, in Italy, but also in Eastern European countries, commons still exist until the present day. In England, for example, there are still over 7,000 registered commons. Urban commons. Urban residents share access to a number of tangible and intangible resources in which they have a common stake. These resources range from local streets and parks to public places to a variety of shared neighborhood amenities. Knowledge commons. The term knowledge commons refers to information, data, and content that is collectively owned and managed by a community of users. So those are just some forms of commons, right? So you kind of get it. It is resources. It can be intellectual resources, such as understanding how to do things, knowledge that is available to everyone for free, water, land, even air. I don't know if you've seen the show Expanse, great show, but air has become privatized for certain people. Honestly, in real life, air has become privatized. I mean, if I'm not mistaken, there's air quality issues in, I want to say, India, where now there's companies selling bottled air. But anyway, so what threatens capitalism the most is free stuff. Free stuff means there's no market. It means you're not making profit. Even though the real wealth is in the commons. Real wealth. I mean, people make money. We think of money as wealth, but it's actually what you spend the money on is what's valuable. You make money so that you can buy a house, so that you can buy food, so that you can buy clothes, so that you can buy what you need. And so the real value isn't the money. The actual value in wealth is what the money buys. It's the clothes itself. It's the food itself. It's the house itself. Now, if you're able to obtain access to the means for producing these things for yourself, if you have free access to the resources to create these things yourself, there's no reason to buy anything. But that takes away the capitalist's power, is when you're able to do that. So, because of free things, access to common resources that affects the whole of the community, that is publicly accessible for free, that takes away one's need to be a wage laborer, to earn money, to buy things, to buy their needs. And so the main mechanism for capitalism is to enclose the commons, is to shut off access to the commons by privatizing it and saying this is no longer publicly accessible. You can no longer produce things for yourself. You now have to work wage labor to make money to provide for oneself, because we've taken your ability to access the materials to sustain yourself. That's called seizing the means of production. Capitalists around the world have enclosed the commons through patents, through privatization, through intellectual property rights. And that is seizing the means of production. So that's my little spiel, and now I'm going to go into quotes like usual. The first book is by Michael Perelman. It's called The Invention of Capitalism. It takes you back to Europe in the 15th century, essentially, and it takes you from the 15th century up to the 18th, even 19th century, and it talks about the process of how capitalism came to be, about how capitalism started in Europe First, by forcing peasants and serfs into wage labor and the fight that the peasants and serfs had against wage labor, believe it or not. Not saying that serfdom, that feudalism is good at all, but the fact that serfs felt that a market-based system and wage labor was worse is definitely something to consider. Now, the way this was accomplished, the way proto-capitalists, meaning before capitalism existed, those who took steps towards developing capitalism, those in charge, those of great influence of this time who weren't quite capitalists at the time because capitalism didn't exist, but were laying the groundwork for it to exist. They had to force peasants and serfs into wage labor. And the way they did this was by a process called primitive accumulation. And primitive accumulation is taking away people's ability to provide for themselves. And just like I was saying before, essentially enclosing the commons was one of them, was one of those ways to take away people's means for providing for themselves. So I'm going to read a little bit here. Common fields and pastures kept alive a vigorous cooperative spirit in the community. Enclosures starved it. In Champion, country people had to work together amicably to agree upon crop rotations, stints of common pasture, the upkeep and improvement of their grazing and meadows, the clearing of the ditches, the fencing of the fields. They toiled side by side in the fields, and they walked together from field to village, from farm to heath, morning, afternoon, and evening. They all depended on common resources for their fuel, for bedding, and fodder for their stock, and by pooling so many of the necessities of livelihood, they were disciplined from early youth to submit to the rules and customs of the community. After enclosure, when every man could fence his own piece of territory and warn his neighbors off, the discipline of sharing things fairly with one's neighbors was relaxed, and every household became an island unto itself. This was the great revolution in men's lives, greater than all the economic changes following enclosure. Yet few people living in this world, bequeathed to us by the enclosing and improving farmer, are capable of gauging the full significance of a way of life that is now lost. That's another thing about the commons, is it encouraged community. That is another piece of capitalism, a side effect of it, a symptom of it, is isolation, alienation. And you can feel that. We can feel that. That is one of the things that I think a lot of people in the world who are subjected to capitalism feel and understand, is the lack of community, the lack of feeling connected to our neighbors, to life, really. We are very disconnected from one another. Everyone just feels like a stranger that you have to kind of look out for almost a little bit. You know, we live in apartment buildings so close to one another, yet everyone feels like a stranger. Commons, a collectively shared resources. Those spaces encourage community, and that's something that's taken away when enclosure happens, when commons are taken away. The brutal process of separating people from their means of providing for themselves, known as primitive accumulation, caused enormous hardships for the common people. This same primitive accumulation provided a basis for capitalist development. Joan Thirsk one of the most knowledgeable historians of early British agriculture, describes above the nature of some of the harshest social and personal transformations associated with enclosures. Some people denounced this expropriation. Marx echoed their sentiment, charging the expropriation of the direct producers was accomplished by means of the most merciless barbarism, and under the stimulus of the most infamous, the most sordid, the most petty, and the most odious of passions. The brutal process of separating people from their means of providing for themselves. The brutal process. This was not something that happened willingly. People fought to be able to provide for themselves. Formally, this dispossession was perfectly legal. After all, peasants did not have property rights in the narrow sense. They only had traditional rights. As markets evolved, first land-hungry gentry and later the bourgeoisie used the state to create a legal structure to abrogate these traditional rights. Simple dispossession from the commons was a necessity. The game laws were a useful disciplinary device in another respect. Many observers recognized that people would resist drudgery so long as they could hunt instead. As an early writer from the United States warned his readers, "Once hunters, farewell to the plow." Similarly, John Bellers, the famed Quaker philanthropist of the time, remarked, "Our forests and great commons make the poor that are upon them too much like the Indians, being a hindrance to industry, in our nurseries of idleness and insolence." The forests and great commons is a hindrance to industry because poor people are able to still take care of themselves. Nurseries of idleness and insolence. I mean, this book also talks about how, yeah, you work hard to provide for yourself, but you had a lot more time on your hands. You had a lot more time on your hands. Medieval peasants had a lot more time on their hands than the modern day US American, let's say. So that was Michael Perelman. And the takeaway is that wage labor is not the natural state of the world. It was forced upon us, and it's through processes of enclosing and cutting off access. It's cutting the public's access off from things that should be free, that should be collectively owned, collectively shared, for us to self-govern. Localization, decentralization. I'm not talking about blockchain decentralization. I mean democracy.